The chair scraped against the floor as I pushed it back. The sound was small, barely a whisper in that enormous chamber, but every head in the Hall of Convergence turned toward me. 43 species represented by their finest minds, their most decorated diplomats, their oldest statesmen, and every single one of them went still the moment I stood up. My name is Mara Voss. I am a human ambassador to the Galactic Council, and I had just decided to end 11 months of talks in 6 seconds. Counselor Drath of the Vel Sherry was mid-sentence when I rose. He was explaining, again, with the same slow and practiced tone he used when speaking to beings he considered intellectually beneath him, that humanity's 12 colony worlds would be reclassified as unaligned resource zones under Council Directive 7 Gamma. He had a long list of reasons. Stability, equity, the greater good of the galaxy. Every word was a legal instrument designed to strip us of what we had built. I had listened to those reasons for 11 months. I had sat in that chair through 419 hours of formal sessions. I had read every document, responded to every proposal, countered every clause with patience and precision and good faith. I had done everything a diplomat is supposed to do, and it had not mattered. Not once. Not even slightly. The vote was already scheduled. 6 days from now, the council would formalize the reclassification. The language was careful and clean, written by species who had centuries of practice making injustice sound like administration. Our people would lose legal sovereignty over worlds they had crossed the void to reach, worlds they had built with their own hands, worlds where children had been born who had never seen Earth and still called themselves human with pride in their voices. I had come here to stop that. I had tried every legitimate path. I had found every door closed, not because our arguments were weak, but because the decision had already been made before I ever sat down. This was not a negotiation. It was a performance. We were meant to argue, lose gracefully, and accept. I buttoned the top button of my jacket, which was a habit I had picked up from my grandfather, who always said a person should look composed even when everything is falling apart. Then I placed my credentials on the table. Not slid. Placed. Deliberately and precisely, as if I were setting down something I no longer needed. Drath paused. He looked at me the way a person looks at something unexpected, something that does not fit the pattern they have spent their whole life learning to read. His crest feathers, the long translucent ones that ran from his temples to the back of his skull, went flat against his head. Among the Velsheri, that meant surprise. Pure, un filter de surprise. I looked at him and I said, very quietly, Earth is done talking. Good day. Then I walked to the door. The hall was silent in a way I had never heard before. Not the silence of a pause between speeches, not the silence of translation delays. This was the silence of an entire room holding its breath. The observer drones hovering near the ceiling dipped slightly, their recording lights blinking in rapid patterns, trying to process what they were seeing. The Mechari delegate to my left made a sound low in her chest that I had learned to associate with the emotion humans might call dread. I did not look back. A person who looks back in that moment is a person who is uncertain. I was not uncertain. I had been certain for 3 weeks. I had just been waiting for the right moment. The moment when walking away would carry the most weight, when the contrast between what they expected and what they received would be impossible to ignore. My aide, a young man named Callum, was waiting in the outer corridor. He had worked with me for 4 years. He was 26 years old, sharp and quiet, and possessed of the rare talent of reading a situation without needing it explained to him. He took one look at my face and said nothing. He simply fell in a step beside me, his tablet tucked under his arm, and we walked together toward the shuttle bay. Behind us, the door to the Hall of Convergence opened. I heard voices, then more voices, then what could only be described as controlled chaos, which on a galactic scale sounds like 30 different languages all trying to be urgent at the same time. Someone called my name in the corridor. I did not stop. The corridor of the hall was built from pale stone that glowed faintly from within, a mineral native to this asteroid that the Velsheri had spent 2 centuries carving into the seat of galactic governance. It was genuinely beautiful, if you could separate the beauty from what it represented. I had admired it on my first day. Now I walked through it as if it were any hallway anywhere, because it was important that the cameras watching me see exactly that. Callum finally spoke when we reached the junction that led to the shuttle bay. His voice was low and even. "How long do you think before they contact us?" 40 minutes, I said. "Maybe 30. He nodded and typed something on his tablet. "Contact the ship," I told him. "Tell Captain Hale we are on our way. And tell communications to log every incoming message, but do not respond to any of them. Not even acknowledgments." "Acknowledged," he said, which was his way of being dry about things. The shuttle was small and efficient, a human design, which meant it was not particularly elegant, but it was reliable and fast. We lifted away from the Hall of Convergence dock with the smooth efficiency of a crew that had run this procedure many times, and as the asteroid fell away beneath us and the stars spread out in every direction, I sat in the rear seat and allowed myself, for exactly 30 seconds, to feel the full weight of what I had just done. 12 colony worlds, 300 million people. They had trusted this process. They had trusted me. I was carrying that trust the same way a person carries something fragile, always aware of it, always adjusting to protect it. Then 30 seconds passed, and I put it away. There was work to do. The messages began arriving at 19 minutes. Callum had underestimated by 11 minutes, which I found slightly gratifying because Callum was almost never wrong about anything, and it was good for him. By the time our shuttle docked with the ESV Resolute, we had 47 incoming messages from 11 different species. The Velsheri had sent 4. The Mechari Conclave had sent 2. The small and usually quiet delegation from the Stori had sent 1, which was extraordinary because the Stori communicated diplomatically once per standard year at most. And there was 1 from the Dur hegemony. Callum held out his tablet so I could see the sender list as we walked through the docking tube. When I saw the Dur name, I stopped walking for exactly 1 step, then continued. "The Dur," he said. "I know," I said. The Dur hegemony had existed for 1100 years. They were the oldest continuous governing body in the known galaxy. They had been members of the Council since before humanity had invented writing. In 40 years of human diplomatic contact with the Council, the Dur had communicated with us exactly twice. Once when we first arrived, to acknowledge our existence, and once to vote against our membership application, which they had done without comment or explanation. The idea that they had now sent a message within 20 minutes of my walking out of the chamber was, in diplomatic terms, roughly equivalent to a mountain getting up and moving to a different country. I told Callum not to open it yet. I wanted to think first. My quarters aboard the Resolute were small, but mine. I had a desk, a narrow bed, a viewport that looked out at the stars, and a photograph of my grandmother pinned to the wall beside the door. She was standing in front of a door in a city I had never visited, wearing a coat too thin for the weather, smiling anyway. She had crossed 3 international borders with nothing but that coat and whatever she carried inside her. I looked at her every morning when I left and every evening when I returned. She never looked worried. I tried to be like that. I sat at my desk, and I pulled up the intelligence files Callum had flagged over the past 3 weeks. Raw signals data, translated communication intercepts, behavioral pattern analysis from the Council observation feeds we maintained through channels I was not supposed to discuss in detail. I had read all of it before. I read it again. The picture it painted was not complicated once you knew where to look. The Velsheri had believed, with complete conviction, that humanity needed the Council. That we were a young species, loud and energetic and occasionally impressive, but fundamentally dependent on the galactic system that had existed long before we arrived. They believed our 12 colony worlds were viable only because of Council-protected trade routes. They believed our defense capacity was an interesting capability, but not a decisive one. They believed, most importantly, that we would negotiate until we were tired and then accept whatever was offered because species always did. Every species always did, eventually. They were not malicious, exactly. They simply had a model of how things worked, and we did not fit the model, and rather than update the model, they had spent 11 months trying to make us fit. The reclassification vote was the final step in that process. It was, from their perspective, reasonable and inevitable. What they had not modeled was the possibility that we would remove ourselves from the equation entirely. Because the Velsheri and the Council as a whole had been thinking about this as a negotiation about our status within their system. They had not been thinking about the fact that their system, over the past 9 years, had quietly and thoroughly incorporated us into its foundation. I opened a specific file and read through it again, though I had it essentially memorized. Our propulsion engineers had solved the deep drift problem in the outer transit corridors 3 years ago. Deep drift was a gravitational instability that made the outer lanes nearly unnavigable during certain stellar cycles. Council ships lost cargo, crew, and occasionally entire vessels to it for centuries. Our people had found the solution in 14 months of work and offered it to the Council as a goodwill contribution to open trading relations. The technology was now embedded in the navigational systems of at least 300 Council vessels across 14 species. If we chose to revoke the licensing, those systems would require complete recalibration, which would take between 8 and 14 months per ship and ground most outer rim trade in the meantime. The medical file was smaller, but more personal. Our artificial intelligence medical diagnostic system had been introduced to the Velsheri Hospital Network 4 years ago as part of an academic exchange. It had reduced diagnostic error rates by 61% in the first year. They had quietly expanded it to every major medical facility on their home world and 2 colony systems without ever formally crediting us or acknowledging the dependency. If that system went offline, it did not mean ships were stranded. It meant patients in critical condition were managed by older systems with higher failure rates. That was a different kind of weight entirely. And then there were the sensor arrays. 6 of the 9 outer rim transit corridors that the Council relied on for early warning against debris events, radiation storms, and the rare but catastrophic rogue mass events were monitored by sensor networks that human engineers had built, maintained, and staffed. We had built them initially for our own colonies, which happened to sit near those corridors, and when the Council asked to integrate them into the early warning network, we had agreed because it cost us nothing and helped everyone. The infrastructure was ours. The data was shared. If we stopped sharing, 6 of 9 corridors went dark. None of this had been planned as leverage. That was the important thing, the thing I had told Callum once when he pointed out how significant the list was. We had not set out to become load-bearing elements of the galactic system. We had set out to solve problems because that is what humans do. We find broken things and we fix them. We find inefficiencies and we improve them. We find people who need something and we build it. 40 years of doing that quietly and consistently had turned us into something the Council had never accounted for. We were not a client species needing protection. We were infrastructure, and I had just told the infrastructure that it was no longer talking. Callum knocked on my door at the 2-hour mark and came in without waiting for an answer, which I allowed because it meant the news was significant. He set his tablet on my desk, and I looked at the screen. The word that kept appearing in the intercepted Council communications across 17 different languages and species-specific dialects, translated down to one consistent concept. I had known what it would be, but seeing it confirmed still settled something in my chest in a way that felt very much like grim satisfaction. Panic, not concern, not confusion, not even alarm. Panic. The Velsheri ambassador had called an emergency closed session. The Mechari Conclave had recalled their senior legal team from a different sector, cutting short a boundary arbitration that had been running for 6 years. The Stori had sent a second message. The Dur hegemony had sent a second message, then a third. And 3 of the smaller species on the Council had opened entirely new communication channels, outside the formal Council framework, pointed directly at human diplomatic frequencies. Outside the formal framework meant outside the system that the Velsheri dominated, outside the system that had just tried to strip us of our sovereignty. Those species were not waiting for the Council to manage this. They were reaching to us directly. Callum looked at me. What do we do with the direct channels? Log them, I said. Do not close them. Do not respond yet, but make sure they know we can hear them. He typed a note. In the Dur, I was quiet for a moment. The Dur hegemony had not spoken to us in 38 years. They were, by every analysis, the most genuinely powerful voice in the council when they chose to speak, which they almost never did. Their silence was their authority. The fact that they had now sent 3 messages in 2 hours meant that something in their 1100-year-old political calculus had shifted significantly. Keep their messages separate, I said. I'll read them myself. Tonight. I looked at my grandmother's photograph on the wall. She was still smiling. She had no idea, in that photograph, what was coming next in her life. She had still smiled. I turned back to my screen. The galaxy was paying attention now. That was the first step. The next step was making sure that the attention led somewhere useful, somewhere that resulted in 300 million people on 12 worlds waking up tomorrow with the same rights they had yesterday and the day before, and every day since they arrived in those star systems and built something worth protecting. I pulled up a blank document and began to write. Outside the viewport, the stars were still. They had been there for billions of years before humanity existed. They would be there long after any of this was resolved. There was something calming about that, though I could not entirely explain why. Perhaps it was the same reason my grandmother had smiled in a photograph taken on the worst year of her life. Some things are simply larger than the trouble you are in, and looking at them reminds you that the trouble, however real, is still only a part of a much larger story. I kept writing. Counselor Ixon of the Mechari arrived at the Resolute without announcement, which was either a very serious breach of diplomatic protocol or an extraordinarily deliberate signal, depending on how you chose to read it. I chose to read it as the latter because Ixon had been practicing diplomacy for longer than my entire civilization had existed, and she did not make unintentional moves. She came alone. No aid, no security, no recording drone. Among the Mechari, appearing alone before a foreign delegation was an act so formally significant that there was an actual word for it in their language, a word that meant something close to arriving without armor. It was not a gesture made lightly. It was a gesture made when words needed to land with full weight, without the softening effect of official process around them. I met her at the docking tube personally. Callum had wanted to send a protocol officer. I told him I would go myself. She stepped through the airlock, and we looked at each other for a moment, and then she made the Mechari greeting, which involves touching the second set of fingertips to the collarbone, and I nodded, which she had told me years ago she found an acceptable human equivalent. Ambassador Voss, she said. Her voice was layered, the Mechari vocal structure producing 2 distinct tones simultaneously, which always made her sound like she was speaking in harmony with herself. The translation implant rendered the primary tone clearly, but I had learned over time to pay attention to the secondary tone because it carried most of the emotional content. Right now, it was carrying something that sat between urgency and something more personal, something closer to worry. Counselor Ixon, I said. This is unexpected. Yes, she said. I imagine it is. A brief pause. May I come in? I led her to my briefing room rather than my office, because the briefing room had a proper table and chairs suited for Mechari proportions, which my office did not. She sat down and arranged her 6 hands in the formal resting position, which meant the conversation was intended to be serious but not adversarial. I sat across from her. Coffee? I asked. She looked at the machine on the side table with the specific expression she always had around coffee, which was a combination of genuine curiosity and mild apprehension. The first time I had offered it to her, 2 years ago, she had accepted out of politeness and spent approximately 4 minutes processing the experience before declaring it interesting in a tone that suggested interesting was doing a great deal of work. Since then, she had accepted coffee every time I offered it, and I had learned to interpret this as the Mechari version of accepting a handshake. Please, she said. I poured 2 cups and set one in front of her. She wrapped 3 of her 6 hands around it, which was the standard Mechari grip for handling human-sized objects, and looked at me across the table. I am not here officially, she said. The council does not know I am here. My own staff believes I am in meditation seclusion. I understand, I said. I need you to tell me what you want, she said. Not what your proposal says. Not what the documents outline. What you, Mara Voss, actually want from this situation. It was a direct question, which Mechari diplomats almost never asked directly. They preferred to approach the core of a thing through layers, to triangulate truth from multiple angles rather than ask for it outright. The fact that she was asking me straight was another signal, another piece of the arriving without armor gesture. She was not here to negotiate. She was here to understand. I wrapped my own hands around my cup. I want 300 million people to wake up tomorrow with the same legal standing they had the day before they came here, I said. I want the 12 worlds to remain what they are. Human sovereign territory, built by human hands, populated by human citizens, governed under human law that answers to Earth and to no one else unless we choose otherwise. I want what was promised when we joined the Council 40 years ago, which was partnership among equals, not managed dependency. She listened to all of it without moving. Her secondary vocal tone, even though she was not speaking, produced a faint resonant hum that I had come to recognize as the Mechari equivalent of processing, of genuinely thinking rather than simply waiting for their turn. The Velsheri believe, she said carefully, that the reclassification is a stabilizing measure, that it protects the colony worlds as much as it reorganizes their administrative status. I know what the Velsheri believe, I said. I sat across from their delegation for 11 months. The document is very carefully written to sound like protection while removing every mechanism through which we could exercise independent decision-making. A protected zone is not the same as a sovereign territory. The words are close, but the meaning is entirely different. Ixon set her coffee down with careful precision. You are aware, she said, that no species in Council history has walked out of negotiations and returned on better terms. You mentioned that in a communication to your senior legal team 2 days ago, I said. Her skin shifted color slightly, a Mechari tell for surprise that they could not fully suppress. You intercepted that. We maintain good signals intelligence, I said, which was the most honest answer I could give without saying anything I should not say. For the record, I did not intercept it with any hostile intent. We monitor what we can because we learned early that the Council does not always say directly what it is doing. She was quiet for a moment. That is a fair point, she said, which coming from a Mechari counselor was approximately equivalent to a formal admission. I know the historical precedent, I said. Species that walk out and stay out become isolated. The trade networks close. The protection frameworks dissolve. Within a generation, they have contracted to a shadow of what they were, and eventually they come back on whatever terms they can get, usually much worse. I paused. That model has worked reliably for a very long time. It works because it assumes the species that walks out needs the Council more than the Council needs them. Ixon looked at me steadily. The layered tones of her voice, even in silence, shifted to something I could not name precisely, but which felt very much like the moment before a door opens. And you are telling me, she said slowly, that this assumption does not apply to humanity. I'm going to show you something, I said. I opened the slim case I had brought to the table and removed a single document. It was printed on physical paper, which I had done deliberately, because physical paper could not be remotely accessed, altered, or intercepted after the fact. I slid it across the table to her. She picked it up with 2 of her hands and began to read. She read in complete silence. Mechari read faster than humans in most contexts, their visual processing more efficient, but she went slowly through this document. She turned each page with careful precision. When she reached the end, she returned to the beginning and read the first page again. Then she set it down. The document was not long. It was 14 pages, but what it contained was a precise and complete accounting of every point at which human technology, human infrastructure, human expertise, or human systems have been integrated into the functioning of the Galactic Council and its member species over the past 9 years. Every propulsion licensing agreement, every medical system integration, every sensor array, every academic exchange that had turned into an ongoing technical dependency, every contract, formal or informal, that the Council now relied upon to function as it currently functioned. It was not a threatening document. There was no language of ultimatum in it. It was simply a list. A factual, precise, carefully sourced list of the ways in which humanity had, without announcement or intent, become woven into the fabric of what everyone else relied on. Ixen's skin went through 3 distinct color shifts while she was reading. I had seen each of those colors before in different contexts, but never all 3 in sequence. The first was the blue-white of genuine surprise. The second was the pale amber of recalculation, of a mind rapidly restructuring an assumption that had seemed solid. The third was a color I had only seen once before, when Ixen learned that a species she had been mediating for 6 years had been concealing information from both sides of a dispute. It was the color of someone realizing that the map they have been using does not match the territory. She said nothing for a very long time. I did not fill the silence. I had learned from Callum, who had learned from somewhere, that silence in these moments was not empty. It was where the real thinking happened, and interrupting it was the single most counterproductive thing a person could do. The propulsion technology, she said finally. The navigational integration. 300 vessels across 14 species, I confirmed. Deep drift solution embedded in navigational firmware. Requires complete recalibration to remove. Estimated downtime per vessel, 8 to 14 months. The medical systems. 61% reduction in diagnostic error rate in the first year of deployment. Now running in every major Velsheri medical facility. Also present in Mechari's secondary care networks, which is how I know you have been using it as well, though that was never formally disclosed. Her secondary tone made a sound I had not heard before. I filed it away. The sensor arrays, she said. 6 of 9 outer rim corridors, I said. Our networks. Our staff. Our maintenance schedules. The data is currently shared. The infrastructure belongs to us. She looked at the document again, though she had finished reading it. It was the look of someone who knows the words, but is still processing their full meaning. You built all of this, she said, and you never told anyone. We told everyone, I said gently. Every agreement was disclosed. Every integration was formally requested by the receiving party, agreed to in writing, and logged with the council. The Velsheri asked us for the medical system. The navigational technology was offered publicly and accepted publicly. The sensor arrays were built for our own colonies, and the integration was formally requested by the Council Transit Authority. None of this was hidden. It was just never looked at all in one place before. Ixen pushed the document back to me. She sat back in her chair, and for a long moment, she looked out at the stars through the briefing room viewport. The Mechari have a word for a moment when something that seemed complicated becomes suddenly simple, not because the complexity has been resolved, but because you have finally seen the shape of the thing clearly. I did not know that word or language, but I recognized the moment it describes. You became load-bearing, she said. We became load-bearing, I agreed. Not because we planned to, because we kept solving problems. It is what we do. And now, she said, you are telling the council that if it chooses to treat you as an administrative resource to be managed, it will discover what happens when the load-bearing elements are no longer cooperative. I am telling the council, I said, that the model they have been using to understand humanity is incorrect. We are not a young species in need of guidance and governance from older civilizations. We are partners. We have been partners for 9 years in practice, even when the official relationship has said otherwise. All I am asking is for the official relationship to match the reality. She picked up her coffee again. She looked into it for a moment. Then she drank carefully in the way she always drank it, as if each sip was a decision being made. The vote is in 5 days, she said. Yes, I said. If the measure passes, what do you intend to do? I had thought about this question for 3 weeks. I had prepared answers for the version of it that came from hostile questioners, and the version that came from neutral parties, and the version that came from friends. Ixen was close enough to a friend that she deserved the honest answer. We will honor every existing agreement, I said. Every contract that is currently active will run to its natural term. We are not going to harm anyone by withdrawing abruptly from systems they depend on. That is not who we are, but we will not renew. We will not enter new agreements. We will not extend, integrate, or cooperate on new systems. And when the current agreements expire, we will pursue those functions independently for ourselves and the council will need to find other solutions. Ixon set her coffee down. That process would take years. Yes, I said, for both of us. And you are prepared for that. We are not happy about the prospect, I said. We would much rather continue as we have been, doing what we do naturally, which is solving problems and building things and working alongside other species, because we actually enjoy it. We would prefer a relationship that reflects what we are rather than what the council wishes we were. But if the council chooses the alternative, we are prepared to manage the consequences. We have managed harder things. This was, I realized as I said it, simply true. Humanity had managed harder things. We had managed things that should have ended us. Every species at the council table had heard the summary of human history. Few of them had truly absorbed what it meant, what it said about what we were capable of when the situation required it. Ixon was quiet for a long time. Then she said, carefully, I would like to take this document with me. I had been expecting this. I had printed 2 copies. I gave her one. She folded it with precise care and placed it inside her outer vestment, close to her body, which in Mechari culture meant she was treating it as personally significant rather than officially significant. Another signal. I am not making any commitments, she said. I am not here officially, and I cannot speak for the council. I know, I said. But I would like you to understand, she said, and for the first time her secondary tone shifted into a register that I associated with deep personal sincerity, the Mechari equivalent of dropping pretense entirely, that I have been on this council for 60 years, and in 60 years I have never seen a list like the one I just read. Not from any species. Not ever. She paused. I think there are members of this council who would vote very differently if they had seen it. I said nothing. I let that sit exactly where she had placed it. She rose, and I rose with her, and we walked together to the docking tube. At the entrance, she turned and looked at me with an expression I found difficult to read, which was unusual because I had been studying her expressions for years. Your people are very strange, she said. It did not sound like an insult. You build things without thinking about what the building means. You share without calculating the return. And then you are surprised when the world has arranged itself around you. We are not always surprised, I said. A sound emerged from her that I had learned, after many meetings, was her version of quiet laughter. No, she agreed. Not always. She stepped through the airlock and was gone. I stood in the corridor for a moment listening to the docking tube disengage, and then I went back to my office and told Callum to get me everything we had on the current voting positions of every council member and when each one had last publicly committed to supporting the Velsheri measure. There were 5 days left. That was enough time if the document traveled in the right direction. Whether Ixon would choose to let it travel was not something I could control. She would make her own decision, the same way every thinking being does, by weighing what mattered against what was possible. All I could do was make the case as clearly as I could, and then trust that reason, when given a fair hearing, tends to land somewhere reasonable. Outside the viewport, the stars remained steady. Callum brought me the voting analysis. I opened it and got to work. The emergency session of the Galactic Council that convened without human representation was, by every account I later received, deeply uncomfortable for everyone involved. I did not attend. I was not invited, which was also a signal, though I was not sure whether the signal was confidence or fear or something in between. What I had was the feed. Callum had set up the display on the main screen of the Resolute's briefing room, and I sat in front of it with a cup of coffee going cold beside me while the session played out in real time through the observation channels we maintained. The image was not perfect. The audio came through in fragments, partially translated, with gaps where the signal was interrupted by the council's own jamming sweeps, which they activated periodically to prevent exactly what I was doing. But I had good technicians, and good technicians are very inventive about working around gaps. The session had been called by the Velsheri. Councillor Drath opened it with what I suspected was a prepared speech about the integrity of the council's decision-making process and the importance of proceeding without allowing the actions of a single delegation to create chaos or set precedent. He used the word precedent several times. He was right to be worried about it. If humanity walked out and the council blinked, Every species with a grievance would file it away as a viable tactic, and the Council's authority over its member species would shift in ways that would take generations to recalibrate. What Drath had not yet accounted for, as far as I could tell from the session, was the document. I was not certain when Ixon had shared it, or with whom, or how she had framed it. I did not know, and I had not asked, because asking would have been a breach of the implicit understanding between us. But I could see the effects in the session the way you can see wind in a field without seeing the wind itself. 3 species that had been firmly aligned with the Velsheri position for months were asking questions they had never asked before. Detailed questions. Specific questions about the navigational integration timeline, about the scope of the medical system deployment, about the operational status of the outer rim sensor arrays, and who currently held the contracts. These were not the questions of species reconsidering their political alignment. They were the questions of species who had just received information that changed the shape of what they thought they understood and were trying to locate solid ground. Drath answered the questions carefully. He was skilled at that, skilled at providing answers that were technically accurate and directionally misleading at the same time. But the questions kept coming from 3 different delegations, and each answer spawned 2 more questions, and after 40 minutes of this, the Velsheri's control of the narrative was visibly fraying at the edges. The Stori spoke for the first time in the session at the 90-minute mark. The Stori were a small, ancient species, numerically few and geographically limited to a single star system. But they had been council members for 400 years, and their interventions were historically significant precisely because they were so rare. When the Stori spoke, the room listened not because of their power, but because of their pattern. They only spoke when they had something to say that no one else would say. The Stori representative asked the council to consider what, precisely, the phrase unaligned resource zone meant in practical terms for the daily lives of the people currently living in those 12 colony worlds. Not in legal terms. In practical, daily, human terms. What would change on those worlds for those people the day the directive took effect? The room went quiet. Callum made a small sound beside me. Drath began to answer, explaining that administrative reclassification did not affect daily life, that the people of the colony worlds would continue their lives as before under council oversight, that the transition would be managed carefully. He used the word carefully several times. The Stori representative waited until he finished and then said, very simply, that they would like that answer in writing with specific legal references for each claim before casting any vote. The request was procedurally unobjectionable. The council had no mechanism to refuse it, and fulfilling it would require the Velsheri legal team to commit, in formal writing with citations, to every promise that had so far existed only as implication. That was a completely different kind of commitment. Implications could be walked back. Written legal references could not. 2 of the 3 uncertain delegations immediately echoed the request. I picked up my coffee, found it cold, and drank it anyway. The vote, when it came 4 hours into the session, was not what I had expected. I had expected a narrow failure, a close result that would tell me how much political ground we had moved and how much remained. What I got was different and, in its own way, more telling than a narrow result would have been. The measure failed, not narrowly. It failed because 12 council members abstained, not voted against, abstained, which in council procedure meant they were present, they were registered, they heard the question, and they deliberately chose not to record a position. In a body that had voted along established lines for decades, where abstention was considered a significant diplomatic act in itself, 12 simultaneous abstentions was not a coincidence. It was a message sent in the language the council actually used when it needed to communicate something that could not yet be said aloud. The message was, "We're not sure anymore." And on a vote that required a supermajority to pass, 12 abstentions meant the math no longer worked. The measure failed without anyone having to take a visible stand against the Velsheri, without anyone having to formally align with us, without anyone having to do anything more politically costly than simply sitting on their hands. Callum looked at me. I looked at the screen. 12, he said. 12, I agreed. That is more than I expected. Me too, I said, which surprised him because I rarely admitted that anything surprised me. What I did not say, but was thinking, was that the 12 abstentions told me something specific about how Ixon had framed the document when she shared it. She had not framed it as a reason to oppose the Velsheri. She had framed it as a reason for uncertainty, for caution, for wanting to understand the full picture before committing to a position. She had turned it into permission to hesitate rather than a call to action, which was much harder to refuse and much less threatening to the relationships these species maintained with the Velsheri. It was a sophisticated piece of work. I added it to the long list of reasons I was glad Ixon was closer to an ally than an opponent. Within 2 hours of the vote result, the Velsheri ambassador sent a formal request for a private communication channel with the human delegation. I declined it formally through the protocol office with a response that was polite and precise and completely firm. The human delegation did not conduct private communications outside formal channels. All contact should be routed through the official diplomatic framework. This was a statement. Private channels meant backroom assurances, the kind that could be shaped to each audience and later interpreted differently by different parties. Formal channels meant everything said was on record, reviewable, legally binding. I was not going to be managed with soft words in a private room. If the Velsheri wanted to discuss the situation, they could do it in a format that meant something. The response from their office took 3 hours, which suggested a significant internal discussion. Then they confirmed they would contact us through official channels. Callum noted this without visible reaction, which meant he understood its importance perfectly. I spent the afternoon reading the messages that had come through the direct diplomatic channels, the ones the smaller council species had opened outside the formal framework in the first days after I walked out. There were 9 now from 7 different species. The messages were various in their tone and approach, ranging from carefully worded expressions of interest in discussing bilateral frameworks to one message from a species called the Harith that simply said, in direct translation, "We think you did the right thing. We cannot say this officially. Please do not mention this message in any official context." I appreciated their honesty. I was working through my responses, carefully calibrating each one, when Callum knocked and came in with his tablet, turned to show me a message that had arrived through a different channel entirely. Not the council feed, not the direct diplomatic lines. A personal communication, routed through civilian frequencies, marked with Earth's standard identifier. My sister. I took the tablet. Nina had sent a photograph. Just a photograph, no text. It was an old print, digitized and resent across however many light years currently separated us. Slightly degraded from the compression, but clear enough. My grandmother, standing in front of a door in a city I had never visited, wearing a thin coat, smiling. The same photograph I had pinned to my wall. Nina had the original. She must have scanned it and sent it when she saw the news, which by now had surely reached Earth in some form or another. I held the tablet for a moment and looked at it. My grandmother had been 23 years old in that photograph. I had been told. She had nothing. She was going nowhere she had chosen to go. The world around her was not arranged in her favor. She was smiling because, according to the aunt who had told me the story, she had decided before she left that she was going to solve one problem at a time and not spend energy being afraid of the one she had not reached yet. I handed the tablet back to Callum without explaining. He looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked at me. "Family?" he asked. "My grandmother," I said. "She would have found all of this very manageable." I paused. She once talked her way through a border checkpoint using a forged letter and a cup of tea she made for the guard. We come from problem solvers. Callum allowed himself a small smile, which was the most demonstrative he usually got. "What is next?" he asked. I looked at the draft document still open on my screen, the one I had been writing since the first night, the framework I intended to table when the time was right. It was not a list of demands. It was a proposal for a new kind of relationship, one built on the reality of what humanity and the Council had actually been to each other for 9 years, rather than the official fiction that had been maintained on paper. It proposed formal recognition of human sovereignty in terms that could not be revised without human consent. It proposed joint governance committees for the integrated systems, rather than unilateral council oversight. It proposed a bilateral review process for any future measure that materially affected human interests. It was reasonable. It was fair. It was the kind of document that an equal rights when dealing with another equal. We request a formal session, I said. Not a special session, not an emergency convening. A formal session, scheduled through standard protocol, at the earliest available date. We table the framework as a discussion document. We give every member of the council time to read it and respond before we sit down. Callum wrote the note. And if they schedule us for 6 months out? They won't, I said. Not after today. 12 abstentions in a supermajority vote is a crisis in council terms. They will want this resolved before the quarterly session. That gives us approximately 3 weeks. I paused, which is enough time. To do what? I looked at my grandmother's photograph on the wall. She was smiling. She always was. To let them understand what they are choosing between, I said. Not as a threat, just clearly. The way you explain something to someone who's been looking at it wrong and needs to see the whole picture before they can make a good decision. Callum nodded slowly. And the door? He asked, which was the question he had been building toward since I mentioned postponing the reading of their messages. You said you would read their messages yourself. Tonight. Tonight, I confirmed. He left. I turned back to my screen, to the framework document still open and waiting, and I worked for 2 more hours on the language of the 3rd section, the one about the sensor arrays and how shared infrastructure should be governed going forward. The language needed to be precise enough to mean something and open enough to invite genuine negotiation rather than defensive reaction. It took until late in the ship's evening cycle to get it right. When it was done, I read it through twice, changed 3 words, and saved it. Then I opened the door messages. There were 5 of them now. I read them in order, slowly, starting with the first one sent 20 minutes after I walked out of the hall and ending with the most recent, which had arrived while I was reading the framework document. Each one was brief. The door did not write long messages. Their communication style was as spare as their speaking habits, stripped down to the essential thing and no more. The first message said, "We observed." The second said, "We have been watching humanity for 40 years. The third said, "We have something to tell you." "Not yet." The fourth said, "You are the first species in our memory to walk away from this table and not look afraid doing it." The fifth, the most recent, said, "When you return, we would like to speak." I sat with those 5 messages for a long time. The Dur hegemony, 1100 years old, the oldest governing body in the known galaxy, watching for 40 years and choosing now to speak. Not during our membership application. Not at any of the 40 diplomatic sessions they had silently attended. Now, in the hours after I stood up from a table and walked out, I did not know what they wanted to tell me. I could not guess because the Dur were, by the assessment of every expert who had ever studied them, genuinely difficult to predict, not because they were irrational, but because they operated on a timescale and with a perspective that made their priorities almost invisible to shorter-lived civilizations. But they had said one thing that I would turn over in my mind for the next 2 days, something I had not expected from any source, least of all from them. You're the first species in our memory to walk away from this table and not look afraid doing it. I pinned that to the same wall as my grandmother's photograph, in my mind, if not on the actual surface, and I went to sleep. The hall looked the same. The bioluminescent stone, the carved columns, the high ceiling where the observer drones drifted in slow patterns. 43 delegations. The translator home. The long table that curved in a perfect arc to ensure no single species occupied a position of visual dominance over any other, which was an elegant idea that had always sat oddly against the very non-equal reality of how the council actually functioned. What was different was my chair. 3 weeks ago, when we requested a formal session and attached a rider to the request specifying that the human delegation required seating accommodation appropriate to human proportions, I had not expected the rider to be controversial. Seating requests were routine. Species had different physical needs, and the council maintained a standard of providing appropriate furniture. The controversy, it turned out, was not about the chair itself. It was about what the chair meant. The original chair in my assigned position had been placed there when humanity joined the council 40 years ago. It was a generic design, standard issue, the same chair provided to every delegation regardless of what they physically needed, which was itself a statement about the council's model of equality. Equal treatment expressed as identical treatment, which is not actually the same thing. The chair my people brought was a human design, built on Earth, shipped here on the Resolute specifically for this session. It fit me. It was built for a human body, at a human height, at a human angle. It was not ostentatious. It was not decorated or unusual in any visible way that would draw attention. But it was ours, and every diplomat in that room understood what it meant to bring your own chair to a table rather than sitting in the one provided. It meant, we know where we are, we know what we are, and we are not adjusting ourselves to fit a space that was designed without us in mind. We are here on our own terms. Callum had been the one to suggest it 3 days before the session. He had come into my office at an unusual hour with a look on his face that I recognized as the look of someone who has been thinking about something for days and has finally decided to say it. "The chair," he said. I waited. "We should bring our own," he said, "for the session. It is a small thing, but I think it matters." I had looked at him for a moment and then said, "Order it." The response from the council's facilities office when we submitted the request had been 4 pages of procedural queries about specifications, materials, and compatibility with the existing table fittings, which I interpreted as the bureaucratic equivalent of stalling while the political offices figured out how to react. In the end, they could not find a valid procedural objection, and the chair arrived in the hall 48 hours before the session and was installed without further comment. When I walked in on the morning of the session, I saw Draft look at it before he looked at me. His crest feathers, the long, translucent ones, moved in a pattern I had not seen from him before. I filed that away. I sat down in my chair, which fit the way a thing fits when it was made for you, and I set my documents on the table in front of me and looked around the room. The framework document had been in every delegation's possession for 18 days. Callum had tracked the access logs and confirmed that every delegation had opened it at least twice, and several had opened it more than 10 times. The Velsheri legal team had logged 41 access events over 16 days, which told me they had gone through it very carefully, probably looking for procedural vulnerabilities, and had not found any significant ones because if they had, I would have received a formal objection, and I had received none. Ixon was in her place across the arc of the table, and when I sat down, she made the small 2-fingered movement that was her private acknowledgement. Not an official greeting, just a quiet signal between people who had drunk coffee together and said true things in a small room. I returned it with the smallest possible nod. The Door delegation was here. They were always here, the 3 of them, gray and still, their ancient faces giving nothing away in a room full of species whose faces gave away everything. The middle one, whom I had been told was their senior representative, though they never used titles, looked at me when I sat down and held my gaze for a long moment. I held it back. Then they looked away. The session was called to order by Councillor Fain of the Harith, who had been elected session chair by a process that had apparently involved significant internal council negotiation before I arrived, which told me that the Velsheri had lost the chair election and were operating without home advantage for the first time in years. Fain was careful and procedurally precise and did not appear to have a personal stake in the outcome, which was the best I could have hoped for. The framework document was introduced as the first agenda item. Fain summarized it briefly for the record and opened the floor for responses. What followed was 4 hours of the most substantive diplomatic exchange I had experienced in 11 months at the council table. Not because it was easy. It was not easy. The Velsheri raised 17 formal objections, most of them procedural, some of them substantive, all of them requiring response. 3 other delegations had specific concerns about particular clauses. The language around the censor arrays generated 30 minutes of debate on its own. The governance committee structure for joint infrastructure was questioned from 4 different angles by 4 different species, each of whom had a different concern, but all of whom were genuinely engaging with the proposal rather than dismissing it. And that was the difference. 11 months of the previous process had felt like walking through water. This was a real exchange. The document was being taken seriously. The questions being asked were the questions of people who were considering actually agreeing to something, who were trying to understand what they were agreeing to, not the questions of people who had already decided and were going through the motions. I answered every question. Callum passed me notes when I needed specific figures. When the Velsheri raised the most significant of their objections, which was a procedural argument about the human delegation's authority to table documents after walking out of a previous session, Fane ruled on it clearly and correctly. The human delegation retained full diplomatic standing. There was no council rule that affected standing based on early departure from session, and the objection was not sustained. Draft looked at the chair Fane was sitting in, the session chair, with an expression that even across the table and across species, I recognized as frustration carefully contained. At the 3-hour mark, the Suri asked a question. As before, the room went quiet. The Suri representative asked whether the framework, as written, was intended as a starting point for further negotiation or as a final position. I answered without hesitation. It is a starting point, I said. Every clause in this document is open to discussion, modification, and improvement through good faith negotiation. What is not negotiable is the principle it rests on, which is that humanity's sovereignty is a fact, not a courtesy, and any agreement we reach must reflect that fact clearly and permanently. The Suri sat back. Something in their posture, a subtle shift that I had not seen before and could not fully interpret, suggested satisfaction. Not agreement, necessarily. Satisfaction with the answer itself. The session broke for a recess at the 4-hour mark. I stepped outside the hall into the corridor of pale, glowing stone, and Callum appeared beside me with water, which I drank, and a summary note of where each delegation appeared to stand based on their questions and body language during the session, which I read quickly. The note was characteristically accurate. Callum had a remarkable ability to read rooms. Ixon appeared in the corridor 2 minutes into the recess. She walked past me without stopping, but as she passed, she said, very quietly, 2 words in the Mekari language that I had learned outside of any official context, in a private conversation years before I ever came to the council. Words that translated loosely as hold steady. I held steady. When the session reconvened, the conversation moved to the procedural question of timeline. How long would member delegations need to review the framework and submit formal responses? This was the point at which negotiations either accelerated or stalled indefinitely, and I had prepared for both possibilities. What happened was neither. The Harith delegation, the ones who had sent me the private message saying they thought I had done the right thing, formally proposed a 45-day review period followed by a structured negotiation session, with a framework document as the basis. 45 days was fast, faster than I had expected them to move, given how slowly council processes normally operated. 2 delegations seconded the proposal before the Velsheri could formulate a response. Drath objected on the grounds that 45 days was insufficient time for proper review. Fane noted that the framework had already been in distribution for 18 days and most delegations had already completed initial review. The 45-day clock, she noted, would begin from today, giving delegations a total of 63 days from first receipt of the document. The objection was withdrawn. The vote on the procedural proposal passed with 31 in favor, 8 abstentions, and 4 opposed. The Velsheri were in the 4. The Dur abstained. I noted the Dur abstention without reacting to it. It was not a vote against the framework. It was a maintained silence, which for the Dur was simply their posture until they decided otherwise. They had told me they wanted to speak. The time for that had apparently not yet arrived from their perspective. I was not going to rush them. The session closed. Delegations began to rise. I collected my documents and stood, and, as I did, I became aware that several delegations were looking at me in a way that had not been present at the beginning of the session, in a way that was slightly different from how they had looked at me for 11 months. It was not friendliness exactly. It was something more like recognition. The recognition of a party that has established clearly and without apology what it is and what it requires, which is a different thing from the careful, conciliatory presentation I had maintained for nearly a year. Callum fell in a step beside me, as I moved toward the exit. We were almost at the door when I heard a voice behind me, speaking my name in a register that was not Mechari, not Velsheri, not any of the species I had learned to place by sound over 11 months. I stopped and turned. The middle member of the Dur delegation had moved away from their table and was standing 3 meters from me, which was closer than I had ever been to a member of the Dur in 40 years of human diplomatic contact. They were shorter than I had expected. Their face was deeply lined, gray-brown, with eyes the color of deep water. They looked at me with an expression I could not fully read, but which contained something I thought might be the oldest version of curiosity I had ever seen in any living being. They said something in the Dur language. The translation came a moment later through my implant, the delay slightly longer than usual because the implant did not have extensive Dur language data to work from. "We told you we would speak," the translation said. "The time is now, if you are willing." Callum looked at me. I looked at the Dur representative. "I am willing," I said. They gestured a slight incline of the head toward a corridor that led away from the main hall, a part of the building I had not previously accessed. I followed. Callum started to follow, and I put a hand briefly on his arm, which stopped him. He understood. He stayed. The corridor the Dur representative led me down was older than the main hall. The stone here was unpolished, the bioluminescence dimmer, the air slightly cooler. It felt like walking into a part of the asteroid that had existed before the hall was built, before the council was formed, before any of the species currently seated in that chamber had evolved into what they were now. It felt, in a way I found difficult to explain, like walking into deep time. We stopped in a small alcove. The Dur representative turned and faced me. Up close, their eyes were remarkable, layered in a way that made them appear to have depth beyond the surface, like looking into still water. "We voted against your membership 40 years ago," they said. The translation was careful and slightly formal. "You know this." "Yes," I said. "We did not vote against you because we thought you were unworthy," they said. "We voted against you because we thought you were not ready for the council. We thought the council would change you before you understood what you were." A pause. "We have been watching to see if we were correct." I said nothing. I waited. "You are the first species," they said, "in the entire history of this institution to become genuinely indispensable to the functioning of the galactic community without seeking to use that position as power, without announcing it, without bargaining with it. You simply built and shared and continued." The words settled in the quiet of the corridor. "We have seen powerful species," they said. "We have seen clever species. We have seen species that built well, and species that fought well, and species that lasted long. We have not, in 1100 years, seen a species that does what you do, which is solve every problem it encounters simply because the problem is there." I looked at them, this being who had existed in this role since before my grandmother's grandmother was born, and I thought about what to say. There was not much to say that would add to the moment rather than reduce it. "It is just what we do," I said. They made a sound that I could not interpret, but which the emotional translation matrix rendered as something close to the word yes. As if yes were not an answer, but a recognition of something they had been waiting to confirm. "We abstain today," they said, "because we do not yet know the right shape of the new arrangement. But we will not abstain indefinitely." Another pause. "When the time comes, we will speak. And when the doors speak in this chamber, others listen." "I know," I said. "Then you know what we are telling you," they said. "Yes," I said. "Edo." They looked at me for one more moment with those deep water eyes, and then they turned and walked back down the corridor without another word, without a farewell gesture, without any of the social conventions that every other species I had ever dealt with employed at the close of a conversation. They simply left the way a mountain simply is when you look at it and then look away. I stood in the alcove for a moment by myself. The bioluminescent stone glowed faintly all around me, older than anything built by any living species currently in that hall. I thought about 1100 years, about what you learn in that time, about how civilizations rise and what makes them last, about what an 1100-year-old institution sees when it looks at something new and decides it is watching something worth watching. I thought about my grandmother, who solved one problem at a time. I walked back to the main corridor, where Callum was waiting with his tablet and his unreadable expression and his perfect posture. "How did it go?" he asked. "Well," I said, "I think." He looked at me. "That is not your usual level of specificity." "No," I agreed. "Some things are difficult to be specific about." He accepted this, and we walked together toward the shuttle bay. And outside, through the high, narrow windows cut into the asteroid's walls, the stars were exactly where they had always been. We docked back with the Resolute, and I went straight to my office and sat at my desk and looked at the framework document still open on my screen and the 45-day clock that had now officially begun. 31 species had voted to enter structure negotiation based on a document that treated human sovereignty as a given rather than a question. 12 species had abstained on a measure to strip our people of what they had built. The doer, 11 centuries old and silent for 40 years on the subject of humanity, had chosen today to speak privately and promised more to come. None of this was finished. 45 days of negotiation, assuming good faith on all sides, which was never guaranteed. The Velsheri would push back at every stage. There would be sessions that felt like going backward. There would be language fights over single words that carried entire philosophical frameworks inside them. That was diplomacy. That was what it was. But the ground had shifted. Something that had been pointing one direction was now pointing another, and the difference between those two directions for 300 million people on 12 worlds was everything. I opened a new document and started drafting the communication I would send to Earth tonight, the formal update to the Council on Human Affairs, and then, separately, a personal message to the people of the colony worlds, the farmers and engineers and teachers and parents, and everyone else who had crossed the void and built something and were waiting to find out if it was safe. I wanted to tell them what I could truthfully tell them, which was not that everything was resolved, because it was not. I wanted to tell them what was true, which was that the situation had changed, that the trajectory had changed, that the 12 worlds still stood under human law, and that the process now underway was a real negotiation between genuine equals rather than a managed performance with a predetermined outcome. I wanted to tell them, and I would find the right words for this, that we had not won, not yet, but that we had done the harder thing, the thing that comes before winning, which is establishing clearly and without apology what we are. The rest follows from that, if you hold it steadily enough. Callum knocked at the end of the ship's working cycle, which meant 9 hours had passed faster than I noticed, and asked if I wanted to eat. I said yes, and he brought food, simple food, the kind that requires no attention to consume, and I ate at my desk while I finished the drafts and reviewed the session transcript and made the notes I would need for the first formal negotiation session in 43 days. When I was done, I looked at my grandmother's photograph. She was 23 years old in that picture, standing in front of a door in a city that no longer existed in the form she knew it, wearing a coat that was not warm enough. And she was smiling because she had decided, before the moment was captured and before she knew how anything would turn out, that she was going to solve one problem at a time. Her granddaughter was 41 years old, sitting in a chair on a ship orbiting an asteroid carved from living stone, in a star system that human beings had reached across the dark to find, carrying the weight of 300 million people who were waiting to find out if their future was secure. I looked at her, and I felt for the first time in many months that the answer to that question was moving in the right direction. Not there yet, but moving. I turned off the desk light, pinned the doer's words alongside her photograph in my mind, and went to sleep. Tomorrow there was work to do. There's always work to do. That is, after all, what we do.